The Mediterranean lay deceptively calm that morning, its surface glittering under a hard September sun. On the horizon, the white-painted hull of the HMHS Somersetshire moved steadily eastward, its sides marked with bold green stripes and massive red crosses. These were meant to be symbols of safety, banners of neutrality under the Geneva Convention. For the 150 nurses aboard, they were reminders that theirs was not a ship of war, but of mercy. But mercy, in 1942, carried no guarantees. At 11:17 a.m., the drone of engines cut across the sea air. Lookouts shouted from the deck as dark specks appeared against the sky. German aircraft moving in tight formation. The hospital ship's crew knew the rules. Such vessels were not to be attacked. Yet experience had taught a harsher truth. Within moments, the tranquil day erupted into chaos. Explosions thundered as strafing fire clattered against the hull. Nurses in crisp white uniforms, their hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, threw themselves across stretchers, shielding wounded soldiers with their bodies. Splinters and shards of glass rained down. The ship groaned under the concussions, smoke curling above the waterline. In one ward, a nurse pressed herself over a man whose legs were bound in splints. Bullets shattered portholes, shards slicing across her arm. She bit down on the pain and whispered, "You're safe. I've got you." Another nurse dragged a trolley of medical supplies into a hallway as flames licked at the walls, refusing to leave the morphine behind. The Somersetshire reeled, but did not sink. By sheer will and desperate maneuvering, the crew held her steady. As the aircraft wheeled away, silence returned, broken only by the cries of the injured. The nurses rose again, their uniforms stained red, moving back into the wards as though nothing had changed. Their duty, after all, did not allow for collapse. This was the paradox of hospital ships in World War II, floating sanctuaries, painted in the colors of peace that sailed through oceans of violence. International law promised them protection, but in practice, they became fragile beacons in waters where no mercy was guaranteed. To serve on these ships was to exist in two worlds at once. On one deck, sunlight and sea air. On another, the smell of blood, gangrene, and morphine. The nurses' hands were steady, not only because they were trained, but because they had no other choice. Their work meant life or death for the thousands carried across these waters. One survivor of that day later recalled, "The crosses on the side meant nothing to the enemy, but they meant everything to us. They reminded us that we were not here to destroy, but to save." On September 10, 1942, aboard the HMHS Somersetshire, that mission endured. Women who had left their homes to serve not with rifles but with bandages became witnesses to carnage, and still healers among ruin. The story of these nurses was not one of battlefields, but of decks slick with seawater and blood, of nights spent listening for the sound of torpedoes, of lives fought for in the liminal space between destruction and survival. This was how the war began for them, not with guns in hand, but with courage tested on the open sea, where neutrality was fragile and mercy itself seemed to be at war. They were painted like no other vessels on the sea. White from bow to stern, two wide green stripes running their length, and vast red crosses emblazoned on their hulls and decks so large they could be seen from the sky. By international law, these were not ships of war, but ships of mercy. Hospital ships, safeguarded under the Geneva Convention of 1929. In theory, they were immune from attack. In practice, their survival depended on the hope that an enemy submarine commander or pilot respected those symbols. Inside, they were sanctuaries afloat, where warships bristled with cannons. Hospital ships carried operating theaters, sterile wards, and storerooms filled with morphine and bandages. On any given voyage, thousands of wounded soldiers filled their bunks. Men plucked from beaches at Dunkirk, deserts in North Africa, jungles in the Pacific. The corridors smelled of antiseptic, iodine, and salt. Engines rumbled beneath the decks. But above the noise were quieter sounds. The rustle of nurses' skirts, the clink of medical instruments, the murmured reassurances spoken to men hovering between life and death. The women who served aboard came from across the world. The British Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, and the Red Cross all sent volunteers to sea. Many had trained in civilian hospitals but stepped forward for something more dangerous. They traded the security of wards in London or Chicago for voyages across oceans patrolled by U-boats. One recalled, "We were told the crosses would protect us, but we knew it was only paint." Their roles extended far beyond medicine. They were surgeons' assistants in improvised operating theaters, where the roll of the waves made precision a battle of its own. They were counselors, writing letters for men whose hands trembled too violently to hold a pen. They were companions in the final moments of soldiers too broken to survive the journey, holding their hands and whispering promises that messages would be sent home. In these quiet acts of mercy, they gave dignity to death amid the brutality of war. Life aboard was a paradox. On some days, the ship resembled a disciplined hospital, with clean sheets, orderly charts, and the comfort of routines. Nurses walked the wards with practiced efficiency, recording temperatures, dressing wounds, delivering meals. Yet just beyond the thin steel hull lurked constant terror. Torpedoes could strike at any moment. Mines floated invisibly in the water. At night, blackout conditions turned the ship into a ghostly silhouette, drifting through darkened seas. Even in daylight, there was unease. The sun illuminated their crosses as clearly to enemy bombers as to friends. The women lived with that duality. They laughed with patience, read aloud from books, and coaxed smiles from men broken by war. And yet, as one nurse wrote in her diary, "We sleep in our uniforms. If the torpedoes come, we must be ready to swim." Their courage lay not in one moment of heroism, but in 1,000 small acts, steadfast work under the shadow of sudden death. Each voyage carried the weight of nations. A single ship might return to Britain or America with thousands of wounded who, once healed, could return to the front, or at least live to see their families again. Every life saved was a small defiance of the war machine, and every nurse aboard knew that without them, many would not survive the journey. They volunteered knowing the risks. They served knowing the rules of war were fragile. They healed in the knowledge that, at any moment, the sea could become their grave. Hospital ships were meant to embody humanity in a time of inhumanity. But as the war ground on, that ideal would be tested. For not all enemies honored the Red Cross, and not all sanctuaries remained untouched. The Geneva Convention promised protection, but in the brutal seas of the Second World War, promises were fragile things. Hospital ships, painted white, bearing green stripes and the unmistakable Red Cross, should have been untouchable. Yet for Axis submarines and aircraft, those symbols sometimes became targets. To torpedo a ship of mercy was to strike at the very heart of humanity, and still it happened. The most infamous of these tragedies came in May 1943, off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The Australian hospital ship Centaur, brightly lit and clearly marked, sailed through the night carrying medical staff and supplies. At 4:10 a.m., a Japanese submarine fired a single torpedo. The explosion tore through the hull, igniting fuel and sending the vessel into chaos. Within 3 minutes, the Centaur was gone, sinking into darkness, taking 268 souls with her. Among them were nurses, doctors, and orderlies, whose only mission was to heal. Survivors described a nightmare of fire and seawater, oil slicks stretching across the waves, and the cries of the dying echoing into the dawn. A handful of nurses clung to floating wreckage, their uniforms soaked black with fuel. One survivor recalled how, even as they drifted in terror, a nurse whispered to the wounded soldier beside her, "Hold on, You're not alone. In that vast ocean graveyard, compassion persisted. The Centaur was not an isolated case. In the Mediterranean, German U-boats struck hospital vessels with the same merciless efficiency used against troop convoys. Torpedoes did not discriminate. They ripped through wards, scattering beds, instruments, and patients into the sea. Nurses who moments earlier had been tending to fevers or changing bandages found themselves cast into open water, fighting for breath amid burning oil. And yet, even there, their roles did not change. They tore strips of cloth from their own uniforms to bind wounds, shared meager sips of water in overcrowded lifeboats, and sang softly to men who had lost the will to live. One diary, recovered after the war, recorded the words of a British nurse adrift for 2 days in the Mediterranean. She wrote of passing her last biscuit to a soldier whose leg was gone, of humming "Abide with me" as night fell, of staring at the horizon praying for rescue. Her entry ended with a single line: "We are not soldiers, but we are in the same battle." These attacks revealed a chilling reality. To many in command, hospital ships were just targets of opportunity. The laws of war bent easily under the pressure of strategy and vengeance. What was meant to be sanctuary became slaughter. Yet amid betrayal and horror, the nurses refused to surrender their humanity. Their mission, to save life and ease suffering, did not end with the sinking of their ships. It carried on in lifeboats, on rafts, and in whispered words of comfort in the final moments of the dying. Those who survived were often brought back ashore only to return to duty, boarding new ships, taking up the same risks again. Their resilience was unshakable. To many, it seemed unthinkable that after surviving such catastrophe, they would volunteer again. And yet they did, not because they sought danger, but because they could not abandon the men still waiting to be carried home. When mercy was attacked, when the sea became a grave, the paradox of hospital ships was laid bare. They were fragile sanctuaries, marked for protection but treated as prey. And in that paradox, the courage of their nurses shone brightest. For most hospital ships, catastrophe did not come in sudden bursts of fire, but in the relentless tide of human suffering carried aboard. Voyage after voyage, these floating sanctuaries became extensions of the battlefield, crowded not with soldiers charging into combat, but with the broken men carried back from it. From the deserts of North Africa, the beaches of Italy, the blood-soaked sands of Normandy, and the jungles of the Pacific, thousands of wounded soldiers were loaded onto stretchers and ferried to these ships. The wards filled quickly, men with shattered limbs, blackened burns, and faces etched with shock. The air was heavy with the mingling of antiseptic, sweat, and fear. Overhead, engines droned steadily, carrying them further from the front, but never beyond the war. The nurses became the anchor in this storm. They treated gangrenous wounds with trembling hands that never faltered. They fought malaria with quinine, typhus with rationed medicines, and despair with words of comfort. They moved from bed to bed, their white uniforms stained with blood, seawater, and exhaustion. One soldier whispered to a nurse as she adjusted his bandages, "Will you write my mother? Tell her I'm not afraid." She nodded, and later, by the dim light of a lamp, she put ink to paper on his behalf. These letters, often the last a family would ever receive, were as vital as any dressing or injection. The ships themselves were overcrowded. Passageways meant for orderly movement became clogged with stretchers stacked 2 and 3 high. Supplies ran short, forcing improvisation. Bandages were rinsed in seawater and used again. Sheets were torn into strips for slings. Food was stretched thin, with nurses sharing their own rations to ensure patients received enough. Seasickness and fatigue stalked them relentlessly, yet they pressed on. They were healers, but also confidants. To some men, they were surrogate sisters or mothers. To others, the last kind face they would see. A diary entry from a British nurse recalled a soldier grasping her hand through the night, unable to speak through his pain, unwilling to let go until death finally stilled him. Beyond the physical wounds lay the invisible ones. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, haunted the wards. Men woke screaming from dreams of battle. Others sat in silence, staring at the ceiling as if replaying horrors they could not name. Nurses sat beside them, listening, speaking softly, offering a presence when no cure existed. They were not trained psychologists, but they bore the burden of the war's psychological scars all the same. Every voyage carried men back to England, to New York, to Sydney, back to homes that waited anxiously. Yet the nurses knew that even survival carried shadows. Some soldiers would never walk again. Others would return home blind or deaf. Many would carry the war inside them long after the guns fell silent. The nurses, too, carried these scars, though rarely acknowledged. The work was unending, a cycle of loading, tending, and disembarking, only to begin again. And yet, they found resilience in small victories. A fever breaking, a man opening his eyes after days unconscious, a patient who whispered a hoarse "thank you" before drifting into sleep. These were the moments that sustained them. The sea was both their prison and their passage. By day they moved through wards filled with sobs and whispered prayers. By night they stared out at the horizon, longing for the quiet of a home left behind. But their resolve did not falter. In every stitched wound, in every letter written, in every whispered word to the dying, they carried the broken home. As the war dragged on, the burden only grew heavier. The numbers of wounded multiplied, and with them, the invisible weight of grief and trauma. For the nurses, the question was never whether they could endure, but how much longer they would be asked to. The guns eventually quieted, but for many of the women who had served on hospital ships, the war did not end. Their battles lingered in silence, fought in restless nights and quiet tears. They carried home more than medals or photographs. They carried memories that could not be set down. Nightmares stalked them. Some awoke to the imagined roar of aircraft and the shriek of bombs plunging into the sea. Others lay awake, haunted by phantom cries of the wounded calling for help they could no longer give. A wartime diary from one nurse captured the constant dread. "We sleep with our uniforms on, because at any moment the sea may swallow us." Their roles were paradoxical. They were hailed as angels of mercy in propaganda posters, celebrated for their bravery under fire. Yet when the uniforms came off, recognition vanished. Unlike male veterans, many nurses were denied the same medical benefits or official acknowledgement of the wounds they bore within. Trauma had no medal, and women were expected to shoulder it quietly, to return to homes and hospitals as though nothing had changed. The weight of guilt was another invisible burden. Every nurse remembered the faces of those she could not save. The young man who whispered his mother's name before slipping into silence. The amputee who did not survive the journey. The comrade lost when a torpedo split the hull. The nurses carried these ghosts into peacetime, sometimes with unbearable heaviness. Yet within their silence was resilience. Many chose to remain in military service, carrying forward the discipline and skills honed under fire. Others returned to civilian hospitals, where they transformed wards with the same courage and compassion that had sustained them on the seas. Patients sensed something in these women, a steadiness, a calm forged in chaos that made them trust them implicitly. Still, the scars surfaced in quiet ways. Some could not bear the sound of storms, their thunder reminding them of bombardment. Others flinched at the hum of engines or the smell of diesel fuel. Few spoke openly of these reactions. Society did not have words for post-traumatic stress. They were simply told to be grateful the war was over. There was also pride. Among their letters and memoirs, glimpses of hope appeared. Memories of soldiers who survived against all odds, of friendships formed in hardship, of moments when laughter broke through the darkness. These fragments became lifelines, reminders that their work had mattered. As history moved forward, their legacy endured quietly, shaping nursing itself. Their wartime service redefined the profession, not merely as a vocation of care, but as a discipline requiring courage equal to any soldier's. They had proven that tending the broken demanded strength of a different kind, the strength to watch men die and still rise each day to face another ward of suffering. The war ended, but their story did not. Though often overlooked in official histories, the women of the hospital ships carried both the weight of trauma and the gift of resilience into the post-war world. In their silence, they preserved dignity. In their endurance, they reshaped the understanding of what it meant to serve. The guns fell silent in 1945. Across Europe, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean, the seas were no longer filled with convoys under constant attack, but with ships returning home. Among them were the hospital ships, docking with their final cargoes of broken men, bodies stitched together, spirits fractured, but alive. Nurses who had endured years of peril and ceaseless duty stepped ashore with little ceremony. There were no parades, no brass bands waiting to honor them. Most walked down the gangplanks into anonymity, their uniforms soon folded away in drawers, their names absent from the headlines that celebrated victory. A few medals were awarded, citations quietly handed out in ceremonies that barely made the papers. Yet, the larger narrative of the war, the battles, the generals, the strategies, left little space for the women who had carried the broken across oceans. Their service existed in the margins, remembered mainly by the men they had nursed back to life. Recognition came slowly, and often too late. Decades after the war, memorials began to rise, granite and bronze reminders of sacrifice long overlooked. Oral history projects, driven by a race against time, recorded voices before they faded forever. Nurses who had once been sworn to silence now told their stories. Their words, carrying the weight of years, lived with memories too heavy to share casually. Among the most enduring figures was Vivian Bullwinkle, the sole survivor of the Banka Island massacre in 1942, when Japanese forces executed 21 Australian nurses. Shot and left for dead, she crawled from the surf, scarred yet unbroken. In post-war years, she testified at war crimes trials, her voice calm but unflinching. Bullwinkle became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience, the reminder that women had faced not only the battlefield's dangers, but also the brutality of war crimes. Her survival and her willingness to speak gave shape to thousands of silent sacrifices. For many others, remembrance came in quieter ways. Books and films began to resurrect the forgotten chapters of hospital ships, placing their stories alongside the more familiar tales of D-Day or Midway. A nurse's diary discovered in an attic, a bundle of letters preserved in a shoebox, or a faded photograph of women in white uniforms against a backdrop of wreckage, all became fragments of a larger truth. Their legacy was paradoxical. They had witnessed humanity at its worst. Men torn apart by bombs, the deliberate targeting of ships marked with the Red Cross, the betrayal of international law. Yet they had also carried humanity at its best, sitting at a bedside until the final breath, writing letters for soldiers who could not hold a pen, singing softly to calm men who would never see home again. In the end, recognition was never equal to the cost, but their resilience reshaped the understanding of war's human dimension. The nurses of the hospital ships stood as living proof that courage was not only found on the front lines, but also in the quiet, relentless act of healing in the face of endless suffering. As the documentary draws toward its close, the sea becomes once again a symbol, both of danger and of mercy. It was the sea that had tested them, the sea that had claimed so many, and the sea that bore their ships of healing through the storm of war. Their memory lingers there still, carried on waves that once bore the wounded home. In the decades after the war, the echoes of the hospital ships never truly faded. The sea, once a battlefield, carried a quieter memory of women in white uniforms who had braved storms of fire and steel with nothing but their skill, their compassion, and their resolve. Today, institutions like MI6, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, and the Red Cross honor them not as a footnote, but as pioneers. Their service helped shape the medevac helicopters of Korea, the trauma wards of Vietnam, and the humanitarian law that now shields hospital ships under the Geneva Conventions revised in 1949. Yet, their legacy is not measured in medals alone. It lies in the paradox they embodied. In a war defined by destruction, they became guardians of life. Their wards were filled not with weapons, but with whispered prayers, quiet lullabies, and the steady rhythm of hands working to keep broken men alive. In their presence, soldiers who had seen too much brutality found fragments of humanity again. For many survivors, the image of a nurse leaning over their bed, penning a final message to a mother or wiping sweat from a fevered brow, became the most enduring memory of the war. Long after battles and bombardments blurred into history, that mercy remained clear. One veteran recalled decades later, "It was her face I saw when I thought I would die. Not the enemy, not the sea, her face." The coda returns us to the opening scene. September 10th, 1942. A hospital ship marked with red crosses cuts through the Mediterranean. Above, the growl of aircraft shatters the air. Bombs fall, fire erupts, and yet amid chaos, a nurse bends low, shielding a wounded man with her own body. Her hands are slick with blood, her uniform torn, but her movements are steady. She lifts, she comforts, she carries life forward even as death presses in. That nameless figure is more than one woman. She is every nurse who walked the decks of those ships, who whispered courage into ears deafened by shell fire, who bore the silent wounds of memory so that others might live. Their footsteps, their sacrifice, still ripple across the waves. And so the story closes not with the silence of the sea, but with its eternal rhythm. The waves rise and fall as they always have, carrying forward the memory of those who turned vessels of mercy into lifelines of hope. In the darkest chapter of human history, they did not fight to kill. They fought to heal,